Had to stop. Well, let's begin. Chuck is here, and others are here as well, and people will join us. Let's begin with prayers. Dear God, thank you for Zoom. Thank you for our friends who can use it. Thank you for Chuck, who has served the church so well in such different capacities and been such a good friend to us. We know we will listen and learn from him this morning, and we are thankful for that. In Christ's name, amen. All right, over to you, Chuck.
Did you say over to me, Daryl? I mean,
yes, please.
David?
Yes, please.
Okay. Now, are you going to load up the handout, or?
You know, I didn't bring it on board. I can do that.
Well, okay. I don't know if people need it, and I'm not the host. I have it in front of me, so I think it makes perfectly good sense. What I would like to do is get fairly quickly, I'll take my watch off so it's in front of me, to the discussion. Let me begin by saying that this is my second class. Someone who is
Chuck,
a member
may I
of this
interrupt
class.
you just for a second? Well, just for a second. If you have your outline or your handout on your desktop, then you can put it on share and we can all see it.
Well, you know what? I think I'm going to waste time if I spend too much time trying to figure out whether it's on best.
Okay, you go ahead and I'll back out and do that.
Yeah, you can back out and do that. Let me just, by way of introduction, do something that's not related to the handout. Today, as I just started to say, I attended the class, the Sligo class that I always attended, and that is the background really of your class. We used to call it the Branson class at Sligo. It now has another name. And Jerry was the teacher, Jerry Winslow, that is. And what struck me right away is that his topic, as well as his presentation, was immediately and compellingly relevant. No one had to be coached into believing that Jerry was addressing an issue that matters. And one of the things about that strikes me about the position of the Christian community, and certainly of Adventist communities right now, is that there would be a fairly substantial group of people who would have to be persuaded that what this community talks about even matters. That would be an issue. And I think that for me, one of the questions behind my discussion of prospects for a post-fundamentalist Adventism is the question of whether, except for people who are somewhat unacquainted with current culture and are not committed to reading, whether there is any hope that what we think about is pertinent, is relevant to what is going on. And I'd like that background, that question, to be somewhat in the background as we proceed, because it does seem to me that the future of Adventism, such as it may be, certainly depends on the ability of Adventists to make a case that what we talk about matters. Now, I say in the handout that my issue today is this: if conventional, and by that I mean the kind of Adventism we were brought into the church by, if an evangelist, say of the stripe of Stanley Harris years ago, or maybe of Doug Batchelor today, if such a person brought us into the church, it's that person's basic outlook that strikes me as conventional today. And so my issue today is whether or not conventional Adventism, let me make sure I get back here, whether or not conventional Adventism is worthwhile, or is it dubious? I think for a lot of people, such as many who attend this class, I have occasionally been lucky enough to go to your class. Many Adventists now think conventional or fundamentalist Adventism is dubious. And to many, one question is whether or not there are prospects for a post-fundamentalist Adventism to which all of us, including those who read, could become genuinely or even passionately committed. I say in the handout that many of us who have abandoned fundamentalism has come also to doubt the urgency. Some have come to doubt even the legitimacy of Adventist efforts to evangelize and thereby recruit new members. But a church that is not only post-fundamentalist, but is also unconvinced of its own relevance, simply can't flourish. It can't last even. It's impossible. The cradle will not produce enough people to enable the community to last and to truly flourish. Now, so let me begin by setting forth three tendencies of contemporary or religious fundamentalism. I don't mean by this description, by the way, to be exhaustive. One is a tendency to flat or mechanical reading of Holy Writ. In principle, at least, all the parts are equally authoritative. Literalism is often a key feature of such interpretation. Another is rigidity or arrogance with regard to contemporary understanding. Reigning or favored tradition is very nearly sacrosanct. A third feature, tendency, is reactive or inward-looking separatism, a sense of being an enclave of right, organized against an entire world of wrong. Now, my premise today is that those tendencies are not any longer helpful enough to qualify as something that's important to us, or many of us anyway. But my further premise today is that there may be some hope for developing a post-fundamentalism version of Adventism, not necessarily as the go-to position of to flourish. And so it's with that in mind that I want to take us to Tonstad Sigbay, with whom you, of course, are familiar. He, after publication of his very fine, or certainly very arresting commentary, he taught your class, I think, several times in a row. I happened myself to attend one of those times. And then earlier he published a book which I think deserves a lot of attention still, namely his one on the Sabbath. So here's what I'm going to do to get us started. I've explained what the issue is. I have some questions at the very end, but to refresh memory, I'm going to both summarize the book on Revelation, which he didn't, in your class, he tended, as he often does, to want to do something fresh and new. So I don't think this summary will be complete to people. It'll be short, for one thing. And then a summary of what he said in his book on Adventism. That's where we're headed. I think we can do this quickly and then have a conversation. Let me then have a look, and you can maybe, since you have access to how to do this, David, you can scroll down if that's possible, so people can go along with this. But anyway, here's the deal with the book of with his commentary in the book of Revelation, which was, of course, published outside of the church in a resource called the Paideia Commentary, which Baker Academic is now producing. Here's what Tonstad argues. And by the way, Tonstad has seen, or at least seen, an earlier version of my summary, so he's had opportunity to correct me, such as that may be needed. Here's what Tonstad argues. He argues first that Revelation, that is the book, is steeped in and understood through the Old Testament, especially, this is my judgment, based on his use of these books, Genesis, Exodus, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah. I think I mentioned Isaiah twice. Maybe that was justified. He says, too, that the book of Revelation addresses a cosmic conflict involving God and non-human agency. In this respect, it's very familiar to Adventists. The serpent, dragon, devil, beast responsible for falsehood and violence on earth is a central preoccupation of the book of Revelation. And of course, in Revelation, it appears to be something real, not just metaphorical. He says, Tonstad does, that he takes the scroll of Revelation 5 to be a repository of troubling questions. He sometimes calls them in the book existential questions about God and humanity. Now, this chapter, he says further, is pivotal for the entire book, and goes on to picture, he does, the Lamb as the book does, the Lamb as the only one worthy to answer the questions, the one who alone is the revelation of God for the rightful recipient of praise. Tonstad says the book is not, now this is a break with Adventism, conventional. It is not a set of predictions about merely earthly times and institutions. It is not preterist, depicting the first century. It is not futurist. and it is not historicist, which would be our conventional view, namely a book that depicts all of history. That is sheds light on the outline of all historical development. Tonstead does, of course, say that the book is pertinent throughout history. The book, as I say in the handout, does pertain to all of history. He says the book focuses on, and this would be a break from what I remember when I heard Stanley Harris's evangelistic series. The book focuses on convictions and moral values, the ones embodied by Christ. That's where the focus of the book is, on moral conviction. He says that time and event-oriented interpretations largely miss the point. Then he says that the book makes God, the renewer of heaven and earth, an agent of healing. God is not an agent of retribution. Despite long-held views, God is not, in the book of Revelation, an agent of violence and punishment. So that's one of Sigve's books that I'm taking to be a plausible resource for effort toward construction of a post-fundamentalist Adventism. Now, the other plausible resource, I will argue, is his one on the Sabbath. And of course, what this does is make it plain that I think we should be interested in a version of Adventism such that we retain our identity as Adventists. And you can hardly do that better than by focusing on the Christian hope, on the revelation that comes through in the apocalypse, and then focusing in the second place on the second day. I should say something that's obvious, by the way, and it's now the case, especially now, that the secular media are advertising their vocabularies by making reference to the word apocalypse. For our purposes, apocalypse means what it meant in the Greek, namely revelation. It has come to be actually a synonym for cataclysm. Let's keep that in mind. In newspapers, it's about the cataclysm. Are you all hearing me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, because I'm somewhere, there we go. Now here's the summary of the seventh day. This again I can do quickly. He argues in that book, which came out in 2009, it was published by Andrew University. Sigve told me one time that he actually had second thoughts and thought he could have sold it outside of the church, but who knows. He says that the Sabbath is the high point of the Genesis creation story that underlies the rest of Scripture. He says that it's prominent in Jesus' healing ministry. It's not only the capstone of Isaiah's vision of ultimate inclusion and renewal, but also an implied element in Revelation's own vision of the new earth. He says it expresses God's love and is thus an affirmation of the human story. It's not an account that suggests our business is escapism, trying to figure out how to get away from the earth. No, it's an affirmation of the human story. God is not distant or remote, but present and involved. God is not, by the way, either a maker of arbitrary tests, but a giver of gifts, intimacy. The Sabbath, Tonstead argues, invites human response appropriate to divine grace and generosity. It invites gratitude for gifts given and bestowal of similar gifts onto others, including the gift of justice as a response to injustice. Sabbath observance without embodiment of Sabbath values is a sham. He says further, because the Sabbath early on became a casualty of Christian anti-Semitism and then of imperial expediency. As the shift from the Sabbath to Sunday advanced, so did the anti-Jewish invective, more and more suggesting a profound discontinuity between Jesus and Christianity. That's a fairly packed sentence. A profound discontinuity between Jesus and Christianity. The Sabbath belongs to the earth-affirming, world-embracing vision central to the Old Testament, whereas the Hellenistic ideology that came in as the Sabbath was going out led to disparagement of the body and withdrawal from the world. He says the Sabbath withstands criticism of those who say Paul denigrates the Sabbath in Galatians and Colossians. In neither of these letters is Paul actually addressing the seventh-day Sabbath, and he certainly does not relegate the Sabbath to oblivion. So Tonstadt claims. Tonstadt says that the Sabbath is a countermeasure both to resignation and to misplaced passion. The Sabbath affirms the human prospect and disaffirms obsession with productivity, consumption, and self-interest, thereby inviting care for the natural world and for all with whom we share that world. The Sabbath, finally, cannot without loss, this is his claim, it's an arresting claim, cannot without loss be detached from the seventh day. Effort to this end has undermined Christianity's indispensable connection to both the narrative and the people most closely in touch with the Sabbath experience. Now, I thought that we could look at several biblical passages. They're all familiar, possibly with one exception. And so I'm not going to read them or ask you to read them until we get focused on a conversation. Some of the selected key passages that I think are a really worthwhile background for conversation are, of course, the 10 Commandments. As children, we didn't learn the version in Deuteronomy, which was a shame, because that one evokes the memory of liberation from oppression. One is Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 and 13, not always on the tip of Adventist tongues, but it's basically where the writer of Deuteronomy, or the book of Deuteronomy, claims that the law has been given for our own benefit. Now, we are all familiar with Mark 2, where Jesus says the same thing of the Sabbath. Now, Isaiah 56 is a picture of the Sabbath, as you know. 58 is a very familiar verse to all of us for its ending, but the first part of the chapter is also crucial. I saw Jerry on here this morning, and I remember I learned, Jerry, from Ernie Bursey that Isaiah 58 is the most important chapter, or the most often quoted chapter. Now, it might be chapter from the Old Testament, I'm not sure, in Ellen White's own account of Scripture. 66 is a expression of the Sabbath as as part of the final experience of unity. 56, on the other hand, is about how the Sabbath is meant to become finally an experience of people who are not themselves ethnically Jewish. And then, of course, Revelation 5, 1-14, which on Sigve's account is essentially the theological touchstone of the entire book. It's noteworthy that as younger Adventists coming into the church through the efforts of conventional evangelists, we very likely never heard a single reference to Revelation 5, verses 1-14. Now, the questions I wrote down, you can read for yourselves, is this effort toward a post-fundamentalist reconstruction of Adventism even worthwhile? I am sure there are some ex-Adventists or cultural Adventists who would say the cause is so diminished in its importance that such energy is wasted. I have held on to the view that it could be worth doing. I recognize, however, that it's a good question whether it's worth doing. Now, one question might be, are Tonstadt's claims fairly summarized? I think that's probably not deeply controversial, but it may be, and I'd be happy to hear from you if it is. And then it may be too that the time may come when someone will want to share some aspect or other of your own Adventist autobiography, spiritual autobiography. I mean, how have you, members of this class would all be in this category, how have you yourself related to the Adventism in which you first believed, where the premise is that you don't any longer embrace the Adventism in which you first believed? Now, one other shout out to Jerry. I heard him give a lecture in January, I think it was, where he quoted a prayer from Alden Thompson, who was our shared colleague once when we were at Walla Walla, in which Alden apparently one time in a prayer to the great God we all serve asked for grace to acknowledge what we used to believe, which is another way, I think, of saying that we who probably are unsympathetic to the fundamentalist version of Adventism might at the same time remind ourselves of the virtue of humility. So that's the handout. Took me a while to get through that. And what I would like to do now is to enter into conversation. And I'm not familiar with how you do it. I'm aware that one can do it by actually raising one's hand, but it might be that we want to do this visually. You can help me to see how we want to proceed. I'm embracing, hopefully, the premise that this is worth talking about. So I'd be very pleased to hear and to learn from some of you.
Okay, just one second. I've muted everybody, so that means if you want to speak, while you're speaking, you need to hold the space bar down on your keyboard. If you hold the space bar down, you will be able to be heard, and then when you're done, if you just let the space bar free, it will remute you. So that's the way to go. Who has the first question or comment? Forrest, I'm going to have to ask you to help me see who's wanting to speak. How about raising your hand or putting up that little...
Jerry Winslow.
Okay, Jerry.
Good morning again, Chuck. It's a rare privilege to go to 2 Sabbath school classes in the same morning with you this way. And thanks for the thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. Are you hearing me okay?
I am hearing you. Yes.
All right, good. One thing that gives me hope for, to use your phrase, a post-fundamentalist Adventism is that having spent some decades working in and around Adventist healthcare, I realized that it's been impossible for Adventist healthcare to maintain that health ministry in a fundamentalist way. And yet, I think you can look around this country and see that taken together, Adventist healthcare is one of the largest faith-inspired health systems in the United States. I think there are signs, arguably, that it's been reasonably successful, certainly under some challenge now. But when this is the place where more people encounter Adventism in our society than any other place, and it just isn't a fundamentalist Adventism they encounter. It can't be. So just have to make that comment and see what you'd say back.
Well, I don't know Helka the way you do, but I did work at Kettering for a spell, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we just can't be fundamentalist in the sense that, say, we might think of Doug Batchelor, who has, as I've learned in retirement, has unbelievable interest among many, many Adventists out in, so to speak, the provinces. But we just can't be that way and expect to contribute to our society. We have to be engaged with the world outside of our church. We have to show respect for a variety of points of view. And so I agree with your assessment, and it's always encouraging, for me at least, to consider what we're doing in Adventist healthcare. And I would say this: I've sometimes in my critical modes, and I'm sure this would be true of everyone in the class, wondered why Adventist healthcare couldn't do X, Y, or Z better, wondered if we're really countercultural enough to be actually faithful to the deepest aspects of our tradition. But even when I lapse into that mode of thinking, I end up with profound appreciation and gratitude. And I've often thought, actually, that if we lost Loma and other healthcare systems, it would constitute a very serious crisis as to whether or not the community would continue to have any worthwhile contribution to make. It's just crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Robert Paulson, right?
Well, I've got Jonathan. Let's go to Robert Paulson. Next time I'll have you call him, okay, Forrest? I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of you.
Okay.
Chuck, question for you. My residence on planet Earth is not as long as some in this classroom and longer than others. And in my observation of the world we live in, the current environment is the most polar I could imagine. There's extreme right, there's extreme left, both politically, church, and about every aspect of the world we live in. Is the need for a post-fundamental Adventism somewhat of a response to that? Because I see my students at Pacific Union College loving Christ, but at times having challenges in dealing with the fundamentalist attitude that they see being pervaded by the church that we love.
Well, I certainly think that these issues are probably related. When I'm in a negative mode, which is a fair percentage of the time, but not, thank God, 100%, it strikes me that one challenge for Adventism is that we are embedded in the present version of American culture, and therefore the prospect for actually achieving some kind of substantial progress toward a new consensus. That prospect strikes me as not as likely as it might be in another era. People just kind of hunker down where they are, and we get this divided world, which I think makes the whole project more complicated. So if that's part of what is in your mind, I fully agree with it. We are in a situation now where the idea of, I have become in my life a fairly serious student of the hermeneuticist in Germany, Gadamer, and Gadamer has an idea of conversation that I think makes considerable sense. I don't say it's perfect, and that is that an authentic conversation is one in which the partners, it could be two, it could be 7 or 8, it could be a whole community, in which the partners enter with the following premises in front of them. One is, I will do my best to express fervently and humbly what I believe. Number 2, I will accept as sincere what my opponent has to say insofar as that is possible. And number 3, we will together attempt to shed the kind of light which will cause each of us to shift at least to some degree toward the other, insofar as that's possible. Our current cultural situation is one in which that kind of conversation is harder than it used to be, at least, to pull off.
Jonathan, did you what?
Am I on? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
And
I
Rodney,
just-
did you want to go next?
I just wanted to say something, kind of building on what Jerry said. I think that if you look at health, the history of health care in Adventism, it has moved from a fundamentalism in the 19th century to a post-fundamentalism now. Whereas eschatology or Sabbatarianism in the same time frame has not made a similar move. If we tied it into the last speaker on polarization, I mean, I think that Sabbatarianism and eschatology has been siloed from the rest of the world, whereas healthcare has opened itself to the culture. And if I were to try to put my finger on it in simplistically, I would say that healthcare has been more open to the wider culture and learned from it and interacted with it in a way that we have not done in our theology. That was interesting to me that Sigbabe said I could have published this book in a non-Adventist press. He was debating that. Well, I think that's significant. He probably could have. Maybe he should have. But the fact that he can speak on the same platform about what we would think of as a more sectarian doctrine is interesting to me. So I think Seventh-day Adventists have something to learn from the outside and something to teach to the outside. And if there is a conversation going on between the two, you're more likely to be able to transition from fundamentalism to post-fundamentalism.
I agree completely. And one of the corollaries really of a concern for fundamentalist for Reconstruction of Adventism in a non-fundamentalist mode is precisely ecumenism, which is something of a taboo, I think, among conservative Adventists. But the kind of ecumenism that I would have in mind is precisely the kind of conversation that I just described. I am not interested really at all in some kind of watered down mishmash of Catholic, Protestant, radical Protestant, Jewish, naturalistic takes on what the world is like. But I am very interested in open-hearted and open-minded conversation with all of those people. And I think that I would concur with you, of course. I think that if we took seriously the potential in the Adventist take on Christian belief, we would come to the point of becoming confident once again that we do have something to say. Mm-hmm. We would become confident without becoming arrogant. It's the arrogance, the pride, the inward focused self-preoccupation, which constitutes effectively death for any kind of long-running and truly responsible Adventist witness. We have to become ecumenical in the sense of embracing conversation, respecting that others have something to teach us. I agree totally.
Rodney, did you have something? Okay, David? And then Donald.
I'd like to go, I see Ron Larson, and if I can go after him, that'll be fine. Should I go ahead then?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Okay, I'd like to develop a thought, maybe take me a minute or two, but I don't think we're in a rush. The basic idea is that, the basic idea I'd like to develop is that Adventism has always been pluralistic, it is now pluralistic, and it will always be pluralistic, and that any hope for Adventism as such to become post-fundamentalist is maybe not the right hope. What we can hope for is a post-fundamentalist school of Adventism that might live in some kind of uneasy comfort with fundamentalist types, but I don't see any prospect for Adventism as a whole, and I don't see there's any reason for it. And I'd like to develop this idea, and that is this. I think we all generalize from the Adventism we know best to presume that that's the way Adventism is everywhere.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that that's right. I'll give you a couple of illustrations. I was at the meetings of the Andrew Society for Religious Studies, and some fellow stood up and said, Adventists believe that one can read a text without its context. Well, my own history is deeply embedded in right-wing and left-wing and middle-wing Adventism. I have never, ever heard somebody, never once, say you can read a text without its context. Not once. Now, am I saying he's wrong? I'm saying the Adventism with which he's familiar, I guess, says that. I can't doubt it. But I have never encountered that kind of Adventism myself. That's one illustration. Secondly, if one reads Adventist Today recently, you see Jim Walters talking about the kind of literature evangelism he was taught to do, and it involved what he calls ethical exceptionalism, whereby one dealt somewhat deceitfully and actually oppressively with the would-be buyers of our books. I have sold thousands of books. Actually, I never sold one. My job was to find the people who wanted them and make it possible for them to have them. I never tried to convince anybody to buy a book who didn't want them. And I always stopped in the middle of the canvas and asked, would you like your spouse to be here? Because if you buy this set of books, it's not going to have, without your spouse being involved, it's not going to have the positive effect we want these books to have on your family. So let's get your spouses together. And so, you know, Jen was generalizing from the kind of Adventism he knew, the kind of literature evangelism he knew in Tennessee, as though it was everywhere. And that simply is not the case. Now, one other example, and that is this anti-Catholic attitude. It's so fascinating to me that so-called self-styled progressives are really down on anti-Catholicism. You know, to be anti-Catholic is really, really bad if you're a progressive, unless you want to smear your opponent and then you call that person Catholic, right? The whole idea of being anti-Catholic sort of disappears when we dig deep into our own psyches and pull up the worst thing we can possibly think of, and that's Catholicism. The worst thing you can say about Ted Wilson is that he's the Pope. Or the worst thing you can say about the executive committee is that it's the Curia, right? Or the worst thing you can say about a conference president is that he's a bishop. Meanwhile, you know, we're smearing each other with the dirt of Catholicism while we, on the other hand, condemning people who are anti-Catholic. I just think there's a deep, deep, deep incoherence there that is not worthy of respect. So what I want to say is Adventism is pluralistic. It always has been, always will be. And the best we can do is have a vibrant, attractive alternative to fundamentalistic Adventism. Enough already. Thanks.
Okay, let me just respond quickly. I agree with you, although I have to say that an investigation of the kinds of things I've said in print probably would qualify as occasional abusive use of Catholic themes as a means of smearing other people. I think I've done that in my life. But I wanted to say yes to pluralism, and then I wanted to make a point about theology. Now, I'm aping a hero of mine when I say this, so this is not altogether altogether original. But what is a theological effort? What is it to be or do theology, which is what we do in Sabbath school, by the way. Everybody does it. It involves at least three things. One thing it involves is an investigation into the question, what in the world is it that we, this particular community, do believe? What are the convictions that set us apart? And what you reminded of us now, Dave, is that if we did that investigation faithfully, we would discover that there are a variety of convictions and beliefs that belong to the Adventist experience. Now, the second thing you have to do is spend energy understanding those beliefs. So we have to ask, do I fully comprehend what a verbal expression of conviction really means? Do I understand that particular individual or that particular community? And the third thing is that we must subject what we learn to critique. Critique, if we're Christian, which is determined by the Lordship of Christ. Another way to put it is that we must, if we are good theologians, reformulate. My teacher, after the age of 70, took an interim pastorate in Pasadena. He published 26 of his sermons from a period of about 8 months, all of them written from scratch. They're not a collection of this person's best sermons. They were published by the Pilgrim Press. And at one point, he talks about what it is to preach. And he makes the point that it's basically that I've just made. And then he says, and then you reformulate. And he said, if you don't reformulate, you're not really a child of the present time or age. You have to do that. So I accept I think you're onto something, and I think it reminds me at least of the obligation, which is the premise for what I've been offering to you today, which is we got to reformulate, rethink, re-express. That's true every Sabbath. it ought to be true for every preacher in every sermon. They're all human beings. I'm a human being. If I do it, I did a Zoom talk last week for people who know nothing about the concerns that probably animate many of you in this class. And I reformulated. I learned a whole bunch of new stuff. That's got to be every time we open our mouths as Christians, you know, within reason.
Donna and then Dick.
Did you say I'm next?
Ron, do you want to say something now?
Whenever you want to have me. I'm not hearing very well.
Go ahead, Ron.
Okay, I've actually got two things, but I guess I should take one, and then if at this time come back to the. I sat here wondering, what is it that creates strong ties to a denomination? And I remembered back to when I lived in Kew Gardens in New York City, and I didn't realize when I bought the house that I bought that sort of up the street and then to the right another street, so I couldn't see it. There was a synagogue, and it was an ultra-Orthodox synagogue, and about half of my neighbors were ultra-Orthodox. Most of the others were secular Jews, and they had nothing to do with each other. The secular Jews, the ultra-Orthodox, were kept apart by being so different and only comfortable with themselves, and having such tight rules about food. Now this all applies to us too. It seems to me that what helps us to be strong ties often is that we believe that we are the true church, and that this makes us very proud of ourselves, I guess. And it makes us different in all sorts of ways, all sorts of rules, the way I was brought up at any rate. And then, of course, there's the fact that we know each other through our education system and so forth. So we trust each other most of the time, or hopefully. Another different sort of situation where we have strong ties is if you grow up, as in the first group, but then you become uncomfortable with some beliefs or some rules, and then what you have in common is having experienced that together, and being able to think new thoughts and get excited about the new thoughts that we didn't grow up as, and I think that's what Chuck is talking about today. It's hard to see how the two groups get on together very well. Certainly when I was in Asheville, North Carolina, I found deep cleavages within the church between those two groups. It helps, in other words, if your congregation has many of the same, rather than a split congregation. Now, I've had many years being the organist in both Anglican or Episcopal churches and in Presbyterian churches. And I got to know their situation and their sense of loyalty too. And the loyalty there is much more to the congregation, the particular congregation, though there's no doubt that Anglicans, for example, think that there's something special about their form of worship and their history. But it's not the same sort of thing as the remnant idea. So I'm not quite sure how we go from to a post. I'm inclined to agree with Dave that I think we're not going to all move at the same time in the same direction. And so the question is how we avoid splitting into two groups. That's thought number one. We'll come back to number two when I get a chance.
Well, I appreciate that, Ron, and I want us all to get a chance to say. So let me just respond by saying the question of what strengthens ties is a very, very worthwhile question for us to consider. One reason I am attracted to the two books by Scriven is that they give us resources for addressing both intellectually adventurous congregations and ones which are more settled or fundamentalist. We can address them with the aid of Scriven on themes that we do, all of us, take seriously. So I think that there are resources here that will enable us to deal with the kind of issue you've raised. But in saying that, I do not subtract even an iota from what I take to be your sense of the difficulty that goes along with maintaining ties, the difficulty of maintaining, if you like, a shared loyalty to a tradition, or if you like, a Christian sub-tradition, even as we, in certain respects, are very, very different. That's a challenge. I don't regard the challenge as impossible. And that's why I preach in front of fundamentalists once a month, and so far none of them thinks I'm outside the pale. Part of the reason is, of course, that I don't get in front of my fundamentalist church and say things that are immediately bound to be disturbing. I think the job of a pastor is to nudge people in a direction, because you don't want to break up, you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, you don't want to break up the community. What you want to do is try to nudge them in a direction. It's hard, but I thank you for reminding us of that. We got to keep that in mind.
Donna?
I just wanted to say that when we're busy being post-fundamentalist, we shouldn't forget about, if you want to call it the pre-fundamentalists, and in particular, I'm thinking of Ellen White. I believe that the reason that the healthcare aspect of the right arm of the message seems to be coming along with the modern world is because she said, look guys, we have to be accredited, we have to meet the highest standards, we have to be part of the world, and we have to recognize the validity of the scientific standards that are set for us, not abandoning some other things, but we do have to realize that if we're going to be effective at all, we have to be part of modern medicine. And I think to some extent, for the theologians, she said the same to you or to the brethren, and by saying, you know, there are no doctrines that we have that are so precious that they cannot be rethought and reconsidered, or as Chuck has said, perhaps reformulated. So in our haste to abandon what we might think of as some baggage, historical baggage, we need to be careful that we don't abandon things that are important. The other thing I would like to say is to give a recommendation for Kendra's latest article in Spectrum about Revelation. Particularly, I enjoyed it, and particularly I enjoyed what she wrote about Cleopatra and the influence of the ancient world's view, or particularly the Roman world's view of Cleopatra, and how that affected the book of Revelation. Those are the only, two women, Ellen White and Kendra. And Cleopatra.
Let me just say that I agree totally that where gratitude is deserved, gratitude must be expressed. And we owe a lot of gratitude to our pioneers. You know, I've always been influenced by Jonathan Butler's piece on the kind of shift that occurred, 2 or 3 shifts that occurred in the early history of Adventism and its eschatology. And some of those shifts were really helpful, and they can illuminate how we think about our work today. Let us praise the pioneers when they deserve it.
Okay, the next one will be Dick Osborne. By the way, I see your hand, John, and I got you on the list.
So I'm about halfway through a fascinating book. The title is Protestants Abroad: How Missionaries Tried to Change the World But Changed America, by David Hollinger. It's a Princeton book. His thesis is that missionaries went abroad and they were going to evangelize the world, especially the mainline denominations. And then many of them began to question their right to even do that. Why is our particular formulation better than the formulation of Hindus or whatever Muslims? And then to try to differentiate themselves from each other, our denomination is better than this one because we have more truth than you have, led to some strong ecumenical efforts, as some of you know, in dividing the world up among certain mainline denominations. Then evangelicals come, like Seventh-day Adventists who are mentioned, and they have their particular way, and they're not interested in working with others, but promoting their particular brand. Then the children of those missionaries actually come back, and the argument of the book is that they become key government officials, key NGO officials in trying to change America and the way we look toward others. In thinking about this book and the implications of Adventism, we've already had someone argue that the healthcare has performed perhaps a similar function, as we saw with these, what in the book calls ecumenical Christians, as compared to the evangelicals, of trying to work together better, trying to get denominations to work better, and not only just denominations Christian, but worldwide religions, and what do we have in common, that they brought those values back to the United States and changed American society through many government positions they held. So I was thinking about this healthcare implication that a couple have alluded to. Has healthcare, which is one of the major institutions of the Adventist Church, had a similar function in Adventism in opening the doors in ways perhaps that were not originally anticipated? And then a second thesis that I'd like you to maybe explore is that in the mid to late 60s and 70s, the Adventist Church actually sponsored a lot of young people to get PhDs from very reputable institutions. And the idea was that they would then bring back from that prestige, a prestige level, to Adventist universities. Have those individuals, who maybe in some cases went to change that university with their ideas, were transformed in ways by being in that environment and brought different ideas back to Adventist universities that have also had a profound, perhaps theological impact on the denomination. So two themes here: healthcare impact, the impact of sending so many on the church's dime to get PhDs and then to come back and work in key positions in the church.
Well, let me say almost nothing about healthcare. It might be fun to have Jerry come in. I do think, I guess I can't help myself, I talk too much, but the one thing that I noticed, at least when I was in Kettering, is that we were non-fundamentalists there in the sense that we were very careful not to offend. I didn't notice among the leadership any, in that particular place, any interest in theology. None. They were interested in not offending people. Now, and that's not quite an overstatement, because I mean, I think the Sabbath school classes at Kettering while I was there were characterized by a fair amount of nonchalance, not to say indifference, on the part of the paid administrators, and even on the part of some of the physicians. So I'll say that. Now, as to sending people off to school, I think that was the right thing to do, but it was dangerous. Here's why it was dangerous. We didn't have, as Adventists, as much self-confidence as might have been useful when we went off to graduate school. So at least in some cases, we came back, I think, not absolutely sure of what to do with our Adventism. I say in some cases, this was not true of all. And so we needed to have, you can never be overstocked, I think, with theological acumen and sophistication, because it helps you in new contexts. And I wish we'd always had that. The other thing I want to say is that I'm not sure we're sending as many people into non-Adventist prestige schools as we used to. Someone else can jump in and comment, but I think that Andrews, and I have a lot of respect for the seminary, but they've suffered a little bit from being ingrown in that the tendency has been for a long time, and it's not exclusively the case, but it's been to hire people who have manage to get a PhD without having to go into one of these environments. So I think the whole question of how we educate our theologians is a very complex one, which deserves more consideration, and one of the reasons it's complex is that it makes the conservative wing of the church, it makes them nervous. I mean, the fact is, people can reject, if you like, the danger of renewal. And that's a real problem in any community, I think in ours too.
Chuck, I wanted to make one other point. I'm not just talking about getting doctorates in theology and religion, but the whole spectrum of getting more highly educated individuals in multiple fields, which in some cases can be a greater challenge than even the areas of theology. Think about some of the areas of science. And even when I was working my PhD in history, I had some not real confrontations, but real questions, perhaps more fundamentally raised with myself than I would have in a theological area.
No, I agree. Education is dangerous to self-satisfaction. And the question is, can we embrace education while also maintaining a due amount of humility and respect for those persons in our church who aren't able to take those steps or who are even hostile to them? That's another, this is hard work.
Okay, did anyone want to respond to? Okay, at this time we'll go to Monty Butler, and then we'll have George and then John. So Monty.
Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, Charles, and I'm continuing to enjoy it. I'm going to end with two questions for you, but let me set them up just a little bit.
Monty, can you turn yourself up a little bit?
I can hold this closer. Does that help?
Yes.
Much better.
Yes, even closer would be wonderful.
Very good. I'm wondering if one way to characterize, or if it's a legitimate way to characterize the shift into postmodernism for Adventists is from a focus of being right. Another way a way of describing that in my experience would be capital T, the church, versus, you know what I mean there, versus having a helpful message. And it reminds me, or two things that have come up today, two topics, is Jerry's discussion about the church, or excuse me, about the healthcare system, and then also your discussion about the Sabbath. Both of those things being messages about having a helpful message or having a way to make the world a better place, as opposed to just being correct or right in terms of our theological interpretations. And one of the things I share with my students, you know, we talk about integrating faith into our educational process. One of the ways I do that, I'm currently teaching a course on supervision. And at the end of the quarter, one of our topics will be self-care for how do you take care of your employees. You know, I'm a social worker. It's tough work. We deal with a lot of tough situations that can be very wearing on the social worker themselves. And so I talk with my students about the Sabbath as self-care. That's the title of the presentation. And I find myself, even within that lecture, talking to them about my progression from kind of a fundamentalist perspective towards the Sabbath into how I see it as being helpful to me day to day and how my life wouldn't be the same without it. So with that, I guess I have two questions for you. One, do you see this transition, maybe a similarity of the transition into post-fundamentalism, paralleling an idea of moving from being right to having a helpful message? And then on the end of that, with that kind of a message, having if you would agree with the idea of having a helpful message, is it possible to maintain or grow a church having that message, or are we dependent on our fundamentalist brethren to recruit new members who then go through a progress of growth? I really wonder that. That's all.
Yeah, I think those are both interesting, and I'll try to be brief here. I think we do have to go from thinking of ourselves in a self-satisfied fashion. We are the remnant. I used to at Walla Walla years ago tell students that we've been called to be the remnant. You know, it's a completely different thing. It's an aspiration. That theme is part of our heritage. It's a worthwhile theme. I still think it goes through the entire Bible, certainly the entire Old Testament. But so I think we have to move toward being helpful. But what I think I would also say is that along with Sigve, I think that we have to imagine that our take on the gospel is not merely pleasantly helpful, but that it may indeed be in some sense deeply important. I am horrified by the respects in which Christianity has shifted away from what almost all Jewish members of our society, whether observant or not, take to be fundamental, namely that our business in the world is to improve it. When we lose the connection with Jews, we gravitate into an escapist and therefore irrelevant form of piety. And so I take the Sabbath to be one of the ways we could reconnect with the Jews, and that it's not just pleasant, it's more than that. It's not just a sabbatical, it's a reacquaintance with a tradition which did give us rest from the ordinary, but also provided disciplined opportunity for re-attending to the meaning of the gospel, the meaning of the call of God as it was first delivered to Abraham. So I'm sympathetic with what you had to say, but I would want to say that we must not shy away from the responsibility of evangelism. I hate to put it out like that because that's a hated word, but for me, the issue is not whether or not to evangelize. The issue is how and with what attitude. And I think that is challenging, and it ought to be pursued with due regard for the virtue of humility.
Okay, we have George. By the way, can I ask if we picked you, would you lower your hand in the sidebar there? George.
Oh, yes. Let's see. I'm trying to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let me deal with the hand later on here. I'm still learning this stuff. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate talking about this issue that is, I have observed through all my life that it's present in Adventism. I lived in Brazil for 40 years. In Brazil, well, it was the more conservative, more fundamentalist you are, the better Adventist and Christian you are. My observation is that this polarization is everywhere in Adventism. In your opinion, do you think that this is just a psychological need to control others? I mean, the position assumed by the fundamentalists, they look at from the podium to us, the rest of us. Do you think it's a psychological need for control? Is it a spiritual weakness? Is it uncertainty about their belief, or something else, or everything, all of the above, in your opinion?
Oh, I think it's in part all of the above. I think that even saying this, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, George, I'm familiar with you from the Spectrum website, that's all. But
exactly.
Yeah. I think it's all of the above, although I hesitate to say that only because it smacks so clearly of self-righteousness on my part. So we got to be careful about this. I think that these psychological needs that you refer to probably affect to one degree or other all of our psychology. So we have to accept or to embrace the truth of what you say while assuring that we are preaching to ourselves as well as to others. But yes, I think there's a lot of psychological need which translates into an unhealthy kind of fundamentalism. Those same needs are part of all our lives. So we, in every case, need to be thinking through the question of what they might mean. And for me, what they do not mean is, I have these abhorrent needs, therefore I should simply cease to bear witness. If we cease to bear witness, we basically give license to the evil that goes on in the world around us. And to be honest, in the world as it is expressed in some Christian communities. Now, my hostilities tend to go toward the very right-wing evangelical version of Christianity, and I admit that, while also hoping that I can give expression to it without coming across as cocksure about my own convictions, because we all stand in need of prayer. But thank you very much, George.
Okay, I'm going to have John Teal, and then we'll have Rick Rice. John?
Could I interrupt just for a moment, please? How do you folk put your hands up? I don't know how to put my hand up. How does that work?
You go to you click on participants and then hit chat, and if you hit chat, there will be a place, I think. Isn't that how it works?
No, David, go down, scroll down to the bottom. There's an icon that says reactions.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to interrupt.
John Teal? You're muted, John.
Yeah, I had that same question too, Dave. Well, am I correct in saying that post-fundamentalists don't necessarily believe all the stories or miracles in the Bible actually happened?
Well, there's probably more than one kind of post-fundamentalist. One persistent. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I muted? Let me unmute. Can you hear me or not?
You're fine.
Okay.
Can't hear anybody.
Tell me when you want me to proceed, someone.
Go ahead, John. Or Charles.
Okay.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
John,
I think I just lost my
John,
train.
you're muted again.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear
Yeah,
you
we
now?
can hear you now, John. And you wondered about whether post-fundamentalists are all people who don't believe some of the stories or the miracles. I would say there's more than one kind of post-fundamentalist. One of the persisting illusions among thoughtful people who are Christians is...
I can't hear anything.
Is that true of all?
And the rest?
No, I can hear you well. John, there must be something wrong with your speaker.
John may have...
I can hear well. Everything okay here?
No, but John may have his audio, online audio thing turned off.
I can't hear anything.
You know, one of you might, I'd be happy to have an email exchange with John if someone felt after this was over that he hadn't been able to hear my answer. And some of you know my email. I'd do it in a minute. But I would say that it's a mistake commonly made that we are all confronted with two choices. One is to be what in my negative moments I might call nut house fundamentalist. And the other is to be liberal, whatever that means. Well, the fact is there is more than one way to be post-fundamentalist. One way to be post-fundamentalist is to basically go in the direction of that, say, Schleiermacher advanced at the beginning of the liberal period, where you just say that Christian speech and talk is an expression of feeling and a response to a feeling, and to set aside entirely the question, are there truth conditions that have to be in place? I had a teacher once who was preparing to celebrate Easter, although he had told us again and again that he didn't believe there was such a thing as a resurrection. There's the third position, I am strongly committed to this one, is that you can be Christian and believe that the way things are, if you like, metaphysics, the nature of the universe, has got to cohere with your beliefs, so that you can do that. And it's a complex matter, but people are doing it. So not all post-fundamentalists would simply dismiss all miracles.
Okay, Rick Rice.
Jeff? Oh.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Chuck. It's always good to enjoy your comments. And I came a little late to the meeting, but I appreciate what I've heard, particularly your summary of Gadamer's view of conversation. I think that's extremely significant. And I know that you've tried personally to reach out in various ways to talk to different groups that may have, whose members may have views different from your own, and achieve some degree of appreciation for each other's.
Okay, let me just listen.
Okay, now I've got to.
Can I not be heard?
Yeah, you can be heard, Ricky.
Okay.
Yeah, John, we'll get back to you again.
Yes, I didn't hear anything.
Yeah,
it was
we'll get back.
frustrating.
We got Rick on now, so we'll come back to you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Let me just say this, Rick. I don't know that I'm. We could take an issue like, have I ever successfully convinced an Adventist who was deeply anti-LGBTQ into becoming less fundamentalist on that issue? And I think the answer might not be yes, because I typically don't push that in contexts where I think it has no chance whatever of advancing. I do say talk about it in essays, for example, and I take that seriously. The other thing I would say is that in my retirement, I've made it a project to try to make sure that some of my energy, you've done this your entire life, by the way, some of my energy goes into precisely interacting with people who are not me. So I've tried to write, I've done it with modest success, essays for peer-reviewed journals that are not Adventist, because I want to be engaged in that kind of conversation that, in fact, I got to know Gadamer because I wrote, it's a long piece and it has been published, but I wrote a long piece on the philosophy of education, which was only recent, published whatever, a year or two ago. And so I have done that, but I wish I could say I'd been, in my address of the congregation I worship with some Sabbaths, I do try to push them in a direction. I'm always a little doubtful as to whether I succeed, honestly.
Well, thank you. My mentor was David Tracy.
Yeah.
And a recent book about his thought is entitled A Theology of Conversation, because that was a major sort of motif in his writings. And he did have some distinct differences from others, but nevertheless, it was his approach, I think, like yours, to be respectful, to be committed to a certain position, but still to be open to the engagement with others who have a different point of view. And so Tracy did that. My sense in graduate school was that I was respected for my convictions as a conservative Christian, but nevertheless invited to participate in the conversation there. I think we have, and what Donna pointed to earlier is significant, the fact that we, with our commitment to healthcare,
Jeff,
your career has taken that direction, would indicate.
Jeff? Yeah, I've got the sound on again. Thank you so much.
I've got to keep going anyway. That we have collaborated, and I think we participated with others. I can think of two other cases where Adventists with particular concerns have been engaged with others. When you look at Ellen White's life, she was very much involved in the temperance movement. Mm-hmm. She spoke as a temperance reformer. She said that was how she was best known to the world outside Adventism. She was invited to speak in Battle Creek when she lived there to a large gathering of temperance advocates. She encouraged Adventists to support the temperance movement. She praised the WCTU and said we should support, collaborate with them, even though we had some differences. She did draw a line when it came to legalized Sunday observance, which many supporters of temperance were in favor of. So there was this, I think, a strong precedent for constructive conversation and even collaboration where we find ourselves in agreement with others. Another area where I think we could engage in meaningful conversation would be more recently with the growing interest in the Sabbath as a day of weekly day of rest. I was in the Powell's bookstore once years ago, and I picked up a book in the religion section that talked about how important a full day of rest once a week would be to a person's spiritual life. And this individual said, it was Wayne Muller, he said, I went to a community that I knew devoted itself to Sabbath. I was kind of hoping that it would be the Seventh-day Adventists, but instead it was Orthodox Jews. And he went on from there. Now, he has spoken at Loma Linda, so I know he's aware of Adventists, but I was sort of engaging after that with non-Adventist views of the Sabbath and ran across a number of discussions of it, including people like Marva Dawn, Barbara Brown Taylor, Judith Shulevitz, and then Norman Wurzbach has written, I think, an area that you would be interested in, the ethical implications of Sabbath. So here we have the Sabbath as a kind of therapy that we need to live full lives. And then we also have a mandate in the Sabbath to have a certain perspective on reality and a way of living in the world. And I think this would resonate to something you have said personally and something you've attributed to Sigby as well. So the Sabbath, in a way, gives us a broad spectrum of concerns that we could be very meaningfully involved in addressing. And I would like to see Adventists do even more along those lines with others who recognize the value of the Sabbath. So I think constructive conversation, which, as you indicated, involves appreciating the viewpoint of others, being open to it, a willingness to connect with them, and yet at the same time, commitment to one's own viewpoint. So conversation can take place without compromise, but still with a degree of mutual respect, appreciation, and even cooperation in areas where you have similar objectives. So thank you for that model. I think it has a lot to say about what Adventists can do in relation to others, both within the church and outside the church. And I could go on with some examples of my own attempt to participate in conversation, but my wife is signaling me that I have said enough.
I loved Marva Dawn. I did a lot with her.
Yeah, I appreciate, Rick, what you've just said. And of course, we all have a lot of appreciation. This class in particular, I know you were teaching it just a week ago. Appreciation for what you've said about the doctrine of God, which has immediate relevance within Adventism, as well as, I think, the evangelical community that you address successfully. We have to be open to conversation. Now, in the philosophy of education I wrote, I called it the rabbi and the gadfly. That was and then it had a subtitle. And you can, all of you philosophers will know who I had in mind, Jesus and Socrates. I think the one thing, even in Gadamer, and I don't know about Tracy, although I remember that he was your teacher. I remember chatting with you about it. Even in Gadamer, what the concern is always, and it's a very relevant and pertinent and even compelling concern, and the concern always is that we listen. We got to listen. We got to enter conversation. We've got to listen to viewpoints not our own. I embrace that 100%. But I had a section in my essay called The Ethics of Affirmation, because in order for the conversation to be truly constructive, we have to, on our part, make the affirmations we take to be true and make them with passion and care and awareness of the need for readiness to shift, to embrace what we learn. Both matter, though, and that's why education, for example, I've routinely heard people say, my job in education is not to tell people what to think, it's to teach them how to think. That is so self-deluded, it's unbelievable, because even teaching people how to think is an expression of a particular standpoint. But it just undermines the prospect for real conversation if one of the partners is so unwilling to take a stand that there is nothing to talk about. We've got to do both, and that means Adventists have to at once embrace humility and a certain hesitancy to be cocksure. Yes, let's do that. But at the same time, we have to be willing to take seriously our responsibility to bear witness to what we believe to be true. Both matter for any constructive conversation. Thank you very much, Rick.
I want to come back to John Teal. Can you hear me now, John? You got to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. The trouble was with my volume switch here. It was already on, and I hit it again, and then the sound came. I was just curious, and you gave a lengthy reply.
May I, John, just give you a brief version of that reply?
Yes, yeah, please.
My point was to say that there is more than one way to be post-fundamentalist. I think most post-fundamentalists would probably have some doubts, at least about some miracles as literal newspaper-like descriptions of what went on in the world. But some post-fundamentalists would deny the resurrection. Not all post-fundamentalists deny the resurrection. They hold on to some post-fundamentalists would say, for example, well, there's no connection whatever between science and theology. So on Monday, I'll put on my science hat, and on Sabbath, I'll put on my theology hat, and I don't care at all about whether the science and the theology mesh in some rationally, if not some rationally acceptable way. Other post-fundamentalists, and here a good example that many of you at Loma Linda would be familiar with, like say Nancy Murphy, the now somewhat retired philosopher of religion at Fuller, she would argue that yes, theology in certain respects has to be pursued the way that scientists pursue their effort to gain deeper insight. So there's more than one way to be post-fundamentalist. You don't have to be somebody that just sneers at the Bible, but I think you do have to be someone who is open to any worthwhile post-fundamentalist is someone who at least is open to and respectful of the scientific method.
Okay, Ted, left or
Okay,
off?
thanks very much.
Ted, are you on still? Okay, Robert Palmer. Capinos.
I was struck a while ago, Chuck, you had mentioned about developing relationship with a fundamentalist. It will be impossible because the basic notion behind being a fundamentalist is to refuse any other definition or any relationship other than what the group believes. So at the deepest level, it will be impossible to reach out to a fundamentalist because that's alien to them, which means moving forward, the church will have to develop means how to cope with this segment that will be forever part of our church.
Well, I would agree with you that, and this goes back to the pluralism point that was made earlier, I think by David, that we're going to have a variety of perspectives within our community. Some members of our community will, having, for example, not had opportunities for higher education or perhaps being overly affected by certain psychological factors, they just won't shift. But I think what we also want to avoid, I'm guessing you would share this view with me, we want to avoid thinking that you can't teach old dogs new tricks. It can be done. It is hard. It isn't done successfully every time. But the whole premise of the Christian gospel is that you can teach old dogs new tricks. It's just hard and it doesn't happen every time. And we have to be generous enough to live peacefully, even with the dogs that don't learn all the new tricks. Nicodemus, I don't know how old he was, but I'll tell you one thing, he said, come on, I'm not. Now we typically attribute to him a kind of naivete, which is a joke, like he thinks Jesus is actually being literal when he says you can't be born again. I think that assumes that Nicodemus is something of a dullard. it might make better sense to say he understood Jesus, but was doubtful whether people can change. Jesus says you can change under the impact of the Spirit. And so I think we need to hold on to that and to our humility and our embrace of pluralism as part of what it means to be a Christian community.
Jerry Winslow?
Chuck, I think you're I know for sure you're a better person than I am when it comes to this question I want to raise right now, because I think I'm going to agree with Dr. Capino that it's difficult to engage a true blue fundamentalist. And here's my question. Do you really why do you want to? Is the hope that you will somehow convince them to be more like yourself? And I remember a conversation I had with a PhD student when I was one, and we were both, I suppose, departing from fundamentalism, as people probably tend to do when you're studying the way we were. And in a quiet, reflective moment on a Sunday morning over brunch, I asked him, Jim, do you really want other Adventists to be like us with our set of questions and so forth? And he thought for a bit and said, no, I don't. I should say that he's gone on to become a Universalist Unitarian pastor. So maybe that was the beginning of it. But why would you want that? And what is the hope for it? And isn't there always kind of a disequilibrium in that it's typical of people who see themselves as more progressive and probably see themselves as post-fundamentalists to want that conversation, but it's unrequited love a lot of times, and it makes you wonder why are you trying so hard for that? It's almost a feeling that I have, and forgive me for this. This is why you're a better person, because I'm actually eager to hear your answer. Anyone else's here. When I go to, let's say, Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, and I see the Amish with their beautiful horses and so forth, I don't know if I want them all to start driving cars and buying televisions and so forth. There's something beautiful about the way they are. Well, I guess that's fundamentalist too. Why just not let them enjoy that, and I'll just view it from a distance?
I, first of all, don't want to change fundamentalists just so that they will become like me. I don't want to do that at all. Nor do I really think, so I'm agreeing with you, Jerry, that it's very productive. For example, in the small congregation I worship in, where I'm of such an age now that I think they care about Becky and me in the way that we care about senior citizens. So during the lockdown here, at least twice, we've had people come to our door to give us something like oranges or a loaf of bread or a Mother's Day card for my wife. These are good people. The one thing that really bugs me is I haven't broken the church up because of this, but they're very conservative about the question of homosexuality and Christianity, and I just don't know exactly what to do about that. But that will be a nice transition point for me. I don't want to change fundamentalists unless the fundamentalism that is embraced is one that excludes people from consideration as fully human. Then I would like to know and would want to make an effort to change them, honestly. What troubles me is I don't always know how. For example, in my little church, one of the couples at the beginning, I came to know them well enough that they were completely completely separated from their daughter, who was gay. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know, honestly, Jerry, I did not know what to do. Now, they've since stopped attending, and it could be because they have complex relationships with their kids. I don't know. But I knew them well enough to know that I would break the relationship with them if I pressed them on this point. So what I did was I lived with a little bit of guilt in the hope that some opportunity would come up. I would like to make them non-fundamentalists in respect of how they relate to their daughter. And it's not, in my view, an unimportant thing to do. But it's often unimportant. And that leads us back, I think, to the prayer that I gave you credit for sharing in my company, and that is that we need to ask God for the grace to remember what we used to believe. None of us is all that smart relative to God. So there's a lot of reason to be, if not unwilling to risk expressing conviction, at least to be aware of the need for humility. So the problem is a problem that I agree it's a tough one, and I think that the way to deal with it is complex. But it does not entail that I just let things be no matter what. I'm happy to let things be unless I see serious damage, and then I struggle to know how I could help to bring about change.
Okay,
Good,
Donna,
good
coming
answer.
back
Thank
to
you.
Donna?
I was just going to say something that sounds trivial, but I mean it as a symbol. More potlucks. I think. I think that socializing with people who have different points of view, even people who we may consider less enlightened than we is very helpful. And the reason we might want to do that, at least on that level, is because there is a value in unity, and you cast your intellectual bread upon the waters, so to speak, and you don't know what circumstance may come to these people later when your insight shared, even if not immediately incorporated by the person with whom you're sharing, might later find that very useful, may someday look at their daughter or his or her daughter and say, I remember what Chuck told me, and I think now I understand it. And I think that happens along as we go along. Those kinds of insights come to us. So that's really all. I think we need to stay together as much as we can, even though we are different and at different points along the spectrum. And then I think that you don't need to be quiet always. That's it.
Well, thank you for that. Maybe I can still make a phone call. The relationship's still there, and my wife knew his wife really well. Maybe we should, maybe now that they're not attending, I should just have the guts to really inquire into that relationship and see what could be done. But I know enough to know that this couple is sort of deeply rooted in a fundamentalist version of the Christian religion. And I'll tell you, it is hard to crack. I don't always know how. I admit it, but I do agree that I should be looking all the time for ways to do it that are suitably humble and sensitive to the social reality, or if you like. So these things constitute challenges that never really go away, but they're worth taking seriously. That's my point. I don't want to live in a world where parents are unable to have constructive relationships with their own children. I don't want to live in that world. But I don't always know how to fix it. And I think the Capino, I know them from, well, actually, I remember you, Elmer, from at least one Adventist Forum conference, but I know you from the website too. And I think that your insights as to how hard it is are helpful. And so is the insight about the importance of eating together. I think we ought to do more of it, not less.
Rick, did you want to respond? You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay. Chuck, when we talk about having conversation across lines of different convictions, I'm reminded of something that Jerry Winslow told me a while ago, and he put me in touch with the rabbi of the Jewish congregation in Redlands. Remember that, Jerry? And we had an interesting exchange, and he had something interesting to say about Judaism, and it was that as relations between Jews and non-Jews were improving, the relations within Judaism between certain perspectives and other perspectives were sharpening and becoming less, what would we say, cordial. And then he I think I got it from him, a quotation that says something like this: "Nothing divides like common beliefs held with a difference." I think sometimes it's possible to find a cordial conversation across a significant difference of views than it is with somebody who is pretty much the same in our perspective of a whole range of, shall we say, doctrinal convictions and lifestyle commitments, and yet there may be a rather vivid difference there in some particular issue, like the ones that you've referred to. And in that case, the divide can be rather substantial, and the prospect of establishing real community can be a real challenge. So that may be one of the complicating factors here of trying to promote community within a perspective that has more in common than we might share with others. So that maybe that's a sociological phenomenon we have to bear in mind, but I have sensed at times that the reservations about me and some of my views within the Adventist Church are not as serious as the reservations that others may have from outside.
Yeah, well, you've underscored the complexity, and I think it's just the case that being a full-fledged Christian witness is challenging, difficult. But on the upside, it's never boring, never boring. So there's always, yeah, we have a lot to be grateful for. God has bequeathed to us a gospel which engages the mind every day and is never boring.
Did you want to respond to that, David?
No, I'd like to get into the queue because mine does, since I'm the host, it doesn't give me a chance to raise my hand here. So when it's convenient, I'd like to talk.
Okay, all right. Robert Paulson.
Jack, I want to ask a question, and it kind of relates back to a story that was before your time at Sligo. I think Bill Lovelace was still the pastor, and I walked into church as a little kid, and my mom looked at this lady, and she says, "Oh, we have a guest." And even as a small child, I was kind of curious as to how my mom knew, amongst all the people that attended Sligo at that time, that this person was a guest. And so I asked her, and she says, "Well, she has earrings on." Mm-hmm. And in doing research in my doctoral work, I did quantitative analysis, and it was easy. You could add up the numbers. It was very clearly definable when something passed that point of significance. But I think a lot of research in recent time has moved into a much more qualitative analysis. And I've told my students in my classes that they are probably part of a generation that is better at qualitative analysis of the world around them than any previous generation. They are much less likely to look at what's on the outside. Do they have tattoos? Is their hair purple? Whatever it is. And I think to some degree, and correct me if I'm wrong, but to some degree, the shift to a post-fundamentalist Adventism is a shift to a world that is much more qualitative in the way that it does its analysis or research towards their relationship with their creator, their God.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would like to say by way of clarification here, Bob, and all of you should know that I remember when Bob would march down the aisle on my right. He was a deacon while I was trying to do my best as one of the pastors at Sligo. The shift to postmodernism that I think we should all embrace, I did embrace insofar as it can help us to be a better community, is not, of course, the same as the shift into post-modernity. I think one of my worries, Bob, is that the younger generation, now this tends not to be true whenever the subject matter is Donald Trump. This generalization is false. Yes. But there is a tendency for postmodern young people to eschew analysis and simply say, let's let everyone be what they want to be. And part of what I think I would argue for is a version of post-fundamentalism that holds on to the ideal of courageous witness, which is witness against received convention. I do think you're right. Even in the church where I attend, and the families are, as far as I can tell, there are no exceptions to what I might regard as fundamentalism. There is no interest at all in judging people by how they look. This is a fundamentalist version of Adventism, in which some people wear wedding bands, a couple don't. People wear earrings, nobody cares. So we have shifted away from that preoccupation with the external, at least to a substantial degree.
Okay, David.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Chuck, for continuing to make a strong contribution, and to everybody else. I'd like to make just two comments. The first is that I agree that there's more than one kind of post-fundamentalism. I also think it's the case that there's more than one kind of fundamentalism. So that pluralism moves both directions, and we ought not to think of all fundamentalists as being the same, nor should we think of all post-fundamentalists as being the same. That's one point. The other point is that I like to build on something I read from Kendra, I think it was some time ago, and she was reflecting on the General Conference, GYC. What is this youth movement that attracts so many thousands of people from a more fundamentalistic background? And her response was, well, there's really no need to fight that, because sooner or later that paradigm starts to fall apart, and then we can be there to help put the pieces back together again. Or contrarily, on the gay issue, I have found it unnecessary to try to convince people unless they themselves have an issue. And so when people want to talk to me about the gay issue, I will typically say, well, are you gay? Or is someone that you love gay? Otherwise, I don't have any time to discuss this with you. But people who are really, really hurting because of the gay issue are looking for ways to navigate that pain and come out on the other side as reasonably healthy people. At that moment, whether the fundamentalist paradigm starts to fall down, as Kendra said it sometimes does, often does, or when we're talking about gay people, gay families, when the way they have been doing things simply doesn't work any longer, then I think there's an opportunity to be helpful. But to not, to make an issue of all these exegetical matters in the text as though they really matter, I think is a mistake. Wait for people to be needing what we have to say.
Yeah, I basically agree with that, although I know that Jim Cox is on your mind today, David, and on mine too. But one of the things I was going to, if I were to say anything about Jim, one thing I might say, I did have him as a teacher, he was superb, is that he came to the Sligo church back when, say, Dick Osborne's wife was a member, I think, of the staff. And we had Jim take us through every passage, or nearly every passage of scripture that is typically invoked as settling the question. And so there's a place, you're right, but I think social intelligence requires that we make careful judgments about when and where. And I don't think it's easy, and I don't think that any decision on these matters as to when and where is probably entirely above reproach. These things are so complicated that whatever we elect to do is subject, I think, to somewhat justifiable criticism, and we have to go back and think it through again. But yeah, we don't. I had Jim came and spent an entire morning, maybe 2 hours with us. Maybe it was only 2 hours. I did not address that issue from the pulpit ever, although I did address it in one-on-one conversation with parishioners. But was I a chicken? You could make an argument that I was. I'm not proud of, I just did my best, and I look back on it and think I could have done better. And I don't even know what better might mean exactly.
Okay, George, do you have another comment?
very briefly regarding to what Elmer Cupino said about changing minds. When I was about around 20 years old, I read from William James the following: "The one freedom that everyone has is to choose their attitude." And I think that we are dealing a lot with attitudes here in this sense, because some people choose not to change. They are not, they choose not to consider others' opinions as valid. They choose to be so strict that, okay, we have to respect their freedom, also is a product of a choice. I say more liberal, as I consider myself to be progressive. But I think that until people decide to choose and change attitudes, which is a psychological component right there, very strongly, then there's really no hope for any, and we have to keep the dichotomy. So we have to live together, respect each other, but not trying to proselytize from one camp into another camp. Just that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Kendra?
This is not saying anything that is new, but I just want to thank Chuck for the idea of taking seriously conversation. And given what Dave was sharing earlier about young adults with different views, I felt it was important to jump in and just witness to how I'm stunned at how the difference when I just start a quarter, when we first start in, and we don't know each other and we don't trust each other in some cases, and how then we go about biblical hermeneutics to the end of the quarter, when we have spent 10 or 11 weeks praying together, wrestling together, sharing personal journeys with texts. Again, it's not always a kumbaya moment. I'm not pretending that at all, but I am just stunned at the difference from week 1 to week 10, when there has been an experience of trust built up and genuine searching and listening and learning to listen better all through the quarter. I'm just amazed at how that occurs quarter after quarter, year after year. And I know many of you have experienced the same thing. And so I just give that as a witness to why we keep trying.
Thank you.
There's someone else wants to get in here. It's me. And I haven't had a chance to get in. But Chuck, one of the things that seems to be missing in this discussion, and I think the Sabbath is very important, but I can keep the Sabbath and not walk into a Seventh-day Adventist church. I can go over in Riverside, go to the Seventh-day Baptist church. As far as apocalyptic literature, I can get into discussions everywhere. But it seems to me that one of the big issues within Adventism is our understanding of the totality of man. And that's why we've emphasized not only spiritual, but educational and health. I mean, National Geographic had Seventh-day Adventists featured one time. So where does that fit into in your thinking about post-fundamentalist Adventism, the issue of the totality of man?
Well, I think post-fundamentalist Adventism, I mean, the trick always is to reformulate your thinking in accordance with the increase in understanding that you may achieve through conversation and study. But if you're going to belong to a community that can be said to constitute a small sub-tradition of Adventism, if you're going to continue to be part of that community, you have to be able to show how the reformulations you suggest cohere with the fundamental identity of the community. And you want to embrace those aspects of the community's life that over time have proven to be helpful. And although I think that the Adventist preoccupation by health with health is both a good thing and a distracting thing. A lot of people, I have relatives, great Scott, who seem to turn almost any conversation into an opportunity to say something about tofu, you know? And I mean, I'm saying, come on, people, there are bigger questions out there. We got to connect again with the Hebrew prophets and with the kinds of scriptures from Isaiah that I heard Jerry Winslow emphasize this morning in Sligo. Having said that, I think that the preoccupation with the whole person is precisely one of Adventism's strength. In a way, it's ironic that we do this, because at the same time we have often, not always, an escapist eschatology, which might lead anyone to suppose that, I used to say, I remember I said this while I was editing Insight, so this goes back to when I'm 24 years old. We know a lot about how to preserve the body, but don't know a whole lot about how to give expression to what we've preserved. And so I think we have to do both. But yes to the health message insofar as it is expressed in the context of and with due respect for the whole gospel. Let's say yes to the whole gospel and to the whole person.